This is the Redeemed Imagination Podcast, a podcast of the Anselm Society on re-enchanting the church. Hello, and welcome back to the Redeemed Imagination Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Brown. And today I'm here with Dr. John Skillen, who is actually, it feels like a much older friend of the Anselm Society than you actually are, because we only met in the last couple of years. But John's writing has impacted us since the beginning. He is the director of the Studio for Art, Faith, and History. He served for 15 years as the Medieval and Renaissance Literature Specialist in the English department of Gordon College. And in his book, Putting Art Back in Its Place, draws from medieval and Renaissance Italy to explore the value of putting the work of art back in the places where communities of faith perform their work. He's been published in Image Journal, the Journal of Siva, Forma, Comment Magazine, and elsewhere. We enjoyed having him with us for our Imagination Redeemed conference last year. By the way, this year's Imagination Redeemed conference is April 24th and 25th. If you haven't got your tickets yet, do so, because they are going faster than they ever have before. Might have something to do with the fact that we're having it in a castle this year. So, John, first of all, welcome and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to have this conversation with me.
You're welcome, Brian. In fact, for me too, it's only been 2 years, but I've got now some lifelong friendships developing with your friends and community. So it matters a great deal to me what the Anselm Society is doing. And it's not just, an idea or some unknown place. It's real people that I've come to love. So thank you.
Yeah, you bet. And I love that we share that love of the particularity. And really the particularity was part of what drove your work in the Oviedo program. Would you share that story with our listeners, how that came about?
Yeah, well, sure. It was over some years back in the 1980s and 90s when I and friends and colleagues, some of the listeners may know Bruce Herman, who's a close friend of mine, and we were coping with what we were witnessing in ourselves as well as in our students and in the culture in general, the slow erosion of historical sense. That's what I'd say of, maybe even in a lit class with me to read Milton's Paradise Lost, but with no students, and again, they're not at fault, they're coming with no sense that when Milton was writing, he was writing in relation to, Dante and then Virgil and Homer. I mean, everything, is connected in that way. The allusions in Dante to Virgil, are part of the fabric of the Divine Comedy, all that stuff, and in the visual arts as well. And that's what one could no longer assume would be in the place of the people that were reading it. So we were thinking about that a lot. So that's a roundabout way of saying we really started thinking we have got to, as best as we can, place our students in context where they can actually feel in their bodies the presence of a tradition. So that got us thinking, because we had this hunch that, for whatever reasons, a place like Italy still has moving power to it and a lot of lessons for it. So we were just poking around for a place. But then I think maybe what you might want me to say is that in that process, I started putting in, the slides of architecture and buildings and artworks. But just showing slides in a classroom doesn't really do it. It doesn't give, a deeper experience. So then, I had a series of month-long seminars in Florence mainly. And they were good too, but then it was too short, and we would still be gawking at things, even if they were a fresco in a church, without a sense, what was going on in that church. So then I always made sure that we'd go to churches, but then one visit to a church where that altarpiece is still doing its work, that doesn't cut it too. It's certainly better than the classroom. But so finally, we all agreed that we really need to settle down in a place, and even though students would be there only for a semester, that the program would slowly gain, as we hoped, the trust of the community, and we could slowly become participants in it. And that the places, if our students could go every Sunday to a church, as they do, either the Duomo or the Church of San Giovanale, and see the artworks in, as we say, in situ, in their place, still doing their work, then that's where it would pay off. So in a sense, that's how we started imagining that we can't just pop in and pop out. We really need to settle down. And, I'm glad to say that we're in our 21st year. I was the director for the first half, basically. And the second half, Matthew Dahl is a gifted leader. And we are so welcomed. We really are part of the town's fabric, and the learning is going both ways, I think. So we now are in a position to, contribute to their cultural life, which we do. And doing that was actually the origins for creating the Studio for Art, Faith, and History to do works in theater and visual arts and music with local people and international people in a way that revivify, to some degree, the town itself. That's a brief sense of why I lived in Italy. I have lived in Italy for the majority of the last 20 years.
That has such interesting implications, this notion of immersing yourself in a tradition. It sort of flies in the face of a lot of things that we consider to be normal, just not because we thought about it, but just because it's the world we live in. One of them being specialization. If I want to be a novelist, I read lots of novels and I hang around with other novelists and I write lots of novels. But the notion even then of engaging in the history of novel writing is a little bit far afield for some. And the notion of connecting that to any kind of larger artistic whole is a step further, and to the whole in the sense of a community and the life of a community. At that point, you're just getting just plain weird compared to what we're used to seeing, used to hearing, and how artists are set up to learn their craft. There's another aspect to it, though, that you've written about that's affected us a lot, and I want to make sure we cover early on, because the poor Anselm Society audience has to hear me throw this phrase around all the time, and sometimes I have time to explain it properly, and sometimes I don't. But you wrote an essay a while back, long before we met, that was originally called The Four Parties to Art, and you suggested that even thinking about the creation of an individual piece of art was about a lot more than the individual artist. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. In fact, that remains probably the key element of that I think has to be addressed when we talk about restoring as the artist to the center of the community, which is what this theme for this year for the Anselm Society is about, the centric genius rather than the eccentric genius. So sure. I want to say that when I talk now, a quick summary of what was in place. What I like the phrase, it's the new title of that essay, is The Works of Art in the Work of the Church, or another title, Who Makes the Art Work? So instead of, I'm playing with that pun, it's the artwork as a single entity, but the artwork as doing its work. So that's the phrase that I'll pick up on here. Who makes the art work? And then, often we just don't think about this, but this is not an unusual thing to point out. And that is when, artworks, they were always commissioned. And I'm talking from 1200 to 1700. I mean, it's a big chunk of certainly European and Western history. It didn't start with the artist. In fact, there would be a community, maybe a monastery community, a town council, and many others. I want to mention the hospital in Siena, which I am just fresh back from a visit to. But in any case, there would be different roles, but there were always these four roles. And that is somehow in the making of a work of art, there was the community or maybe a representative of that community. And then there was always a patron. I mean, that had to do with funding, the person that had the commitment and the sense that this would be an important thing for artwork for it to be for the place that it was intended for. Famous people like Cosimo de' Medici was simply a financially generous patron for all kinds of places in Florence, including San Marco, the monastery. Anyway, so there'd be a community representative, the patron, but then a role that I realize it doesn't always turn up in the contracts for these things, but it was almost always there. And that is an appointed advisor, which would be the one that works with the artist to get across the purpose, the frame of reference, the conceptual ideas that for the community, they would expect to be exhibited and explored by the work of art. And then the artist was actually the last one in the line. Then you went out and commissioned and hired an artist and the studio of the artist to do the work. So, I might say that, we can underline that this neither gave the artist free rein the way artists, are expected and welcome to have in the last couple of centuries. But nor do they rein in the artist as simply, the functionary of making something that's already totally defined. So that what artists were certainly, they were the ones that were gifted and trained to bring visual form to ideas and concepts and structures of virtues and vices and the like, of what good and bad government would look like. So that was the role, that the artist had. So anyway, those four, and we're talking about meeting together. I think, right from Orvieto in the Duomo, the cathedral built, in the early 1300s, the added on transept chapel that is now housing one of the great fresco cycles, and that's The Last Times and The Last Judgment and the End Times by Luca Signorelli, building on work that had begun by Fra Angelico. Anyway, in his contract, the phrase in Latin is that he was obliged to work. This was a contractual obligation to work closely with the masters of the sacred page, which there's little doubt that refers to the theologians from the Dominican monastery in town. Someone no less than Thomas Aquinas lived for 5 or 6 years and taught and wrote there. So he was to work closely with the Dominicans, who would then make sure that Signorelli understood and was embodying in paint and fresco a view of the coming of Christ again in great majesty, the separating of the sheep and the goats, that all of that would be, I guess we can say theologically correct. That would be what ought to be, that the effect of the visuals should match adequately the intent and the teaching of the fresco. So in any case, the role of the advisor, I'll give another example that probably is my favorite because it's so rich. And this alludes to my own learning process as well. There's one of my favorite artworks, even from adolescence, was Raphael's School of Athens. And I think I had, reproductions on the wall of my room and house. So I've always loved that painting and thought of it, associated it just as itself in the Vatican museums. And when I made that first visit 20 years ago and with students, it just bowled me over when I walked in and realized and learned a bit more about that is just a one-wall painting of Pope Julius II's library. And that's what the room was made for. And he was commissioned. And what's clear enough is that what he was painting was a visual card catalog. That's parts of the collection of manuscripts that Pope Julius had brought together. And that library would be open for scholars to study and read and do research. In any case, the collection were the philosophy texts, and those, as recent studies have shown, there seem to be even the fittings for the big cases for the books underneath each wall, so that it's almost certain that the philosophy books or manuscripts were under the philosophy painting, and then opposite to it, the theology books were under the theology wall. And then the jurisprudence books were under the law given to the theme of justice. And then all those poetry and literature books, I'm from Homer to Virgil to Dante and lots of others, were under the poetry wall. So anyway, to realize that that room wasn't just one painting that we always pluck out of context, but it was 4 paintings working together, and anyone looking at those paintings was actually reading books there. So that changed my way of thinking, and I guess I realized that I thought, wow, we can't repeat that painting, but we could understand that idea and that framing of the artwork. And we ought to be doing that for ourselves now, that schools and churches in all kinds of ways could understand that the artwork actually helps them do their work. It isn't just icing or decorative, things like that you could take down and put up anywhere. So in a sense, that's what I was learning, and not only learning historically, but thinking that this may be a better way to go than simply honoring but jettisoning the artist from both grounding any engaged membership, any welcoming in some deep way for the importance of the work of the artist in the church and in civic life. Well, I'll catch my breath. I gave a mouthful there.
It seems like there's a challenge there as we think about, at Ensom, we never advocate simply copying and pasting from history. And so there's this mythical golden age, and we found it, and it's this 7-year period that we're particularly fond of. But as we look at things that have been done well in either art history or church history or both, and we ask the question, what is it about this that is good and true and beautiful that we can learn from and draw from and maybe imitate at a very detailed level? It seems like the problem that we might run into in this kind of area is twofold. There's a little bit of a problem on the artist end and a little bit of a problem on the audience end or the potential patron. We recently, this was just a short-term project, but as part of our Christmas party back in December, we had a commission where we invited a whole bunch of our visual artists to collaborate together on a backdrop for the stage, which you've seen.
Yeah,
and it was very interesting because it was such a liberating process for them. They took such joy in doing that and knowing that even for that short time, and it actually wasn't just for the one evening, we're going to use it every time we do a pub night event, but even for that one evening here and there sort of thing, the artists, far from resenting the restrictions that came with a commission like that, were excited that was going to work in that sense. However, I think I'm safe in saying that most, if not all of them, would consider a project like that to be the exception rather than the rule as far as how they go about deciding what art to create and how and for whom and why. A more normal process is working out with fear and trembling the thoughts in their own minds, the things, the inspiration that they have on their own. What do I want to paint today? What's been bothering me? What's my project that I'm working on chipping away at over time? That latter is more the norm, and the former, the backdrop type situation, the commissioned work, more the exception. Do you see a problem in that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Brian. Yeah, I think I wouldn't say the word problem. I'd say it's a challenge, and it's a complex one that will take a few decades even to work through, and we're in the midst of those decades, I think. If we ask, which in a certain way I am, and you and some society are now too, and that is to be inviting the artist, and then I'll use, maybe a problematic word, more submissive to a project and a place that's not been unilateral. It's not been only their idea to do. So I know lots of artists and serious artists who are friends, and I see them on different places of some kind of path where they are still resistant to doing things that don't originate out of their own imaginative desire to make, whether that's rooted in a strong emotion or simply a love of a particular, scene or site, whatever that might be. When that has been the shaping framework, which it has for about 2 centuries of, how art, visual art, paintings and sculptures and the like are generated, then you can't expect people whose vocations have been shaped under that paradigm just to wake up, Monday morning and say, I'm going to change it all. I'm not going to operate that way. So it requires change. But then, I know more and more artists who do wish, and I can't fault them for this, to do works that are simply generated by themselves, in a sense, in the studio or in their own, I say, deeper imagination. Or someone, I don't scorn in the least the roles of art nowadays that we might call therapeutic. The need to articulate in musical or visual form, a struggle that one is happening. One of our daughters is an art therapist and knows deeply the role that the arts can play in bringing up out of, the underworld, the situations that are really generating a young person's or an older person's life and what has been the source of their struggles. Why is it that they are the way they are? That's, in other words, here. That is, if the art making can provide any kind of a therapeutic role, either for the artist herself or for those looking at it, I'm just not in a position to want to say that's rubbish or that's irrelevant. But I'm also saying that it does keep it in the realm of the individual, of the personal. It doesn't quite lend itself to, collective group or liturgical therapy or something. So, and I say, getting back to how I know people that are variously located or would locate themselves on this process or spectrum. Some, though, And a lot of my artist friends are much more willing nowadays to accept commissions. And what I can say, I'll defer to my own art teachers on this, but I think we're all seeing an increasing willingness of students, of young people, to be envisioning and enacting their work as artists in some collective sense. So either a collaborative work that they're working on with other artists, or it collaborative, say, in working, painting along ekphrastically with a poet, to see without scorn at all, being able to paint, the background for a play, things like that, and then also be doing things that are going to be used in a church community in some way. So I see slowly, just less resistance. And then I think I'd probably want to add this. It isn't the majority yet. Lots of us speak about the deep loneliness that has been created by, cultural forces that are huge in our time. Everything, that's been written about sufficiently, I trust, is that, we have our Facebook friends, or we resort for fellowship or community to, I call them ersatz, cyberspace friends, but it never does the trick. There's just a lot of teenagers, spending all day on social media and are desperately lonely. So I'm saying what that is generating slowly, but I think surely, is even among the young folk, a sense that they just starve for friendship, and friendship that is actually, bodily present. Somebody that you can turn to, not just for, a tweet, but somebody that's going to be there for you, and a group of people that is trustworthy. So there's this deep hunger, I think, for doing everything in much more collectively or in a community than has been in the past. And I'm seeing that with our college students, all the ways in which they deliberately gather in communities, that their desires that it really be commitment to one another, through some longer period of time, not just for the weekend or something. So anyway, I'm just saying, I think the change, even for the younger artists on the scene, they're simply not resistant to works that would be in and for the locations of a particular community. And then I say at the other end is that I am hearing artists saying, man, I'm getting a couple commissions and it's great. My finances are stabilized. I can sleep better. It's great that I can go and see this work being used and present in a community week after week. So I think a lot of people, I suppose that the autonomy of the artist period that we've been is in fact slowly dissolving. And actually, I think the church could be at the heart of, in a way that it isn't yet, of providing, not be last in the game, but be providing very good conditions for artists to be doing work that is made from the start, to be operating in the bosom of that community.
Well, it sounds like we've circled back to the particular now. We started out talking about our shared love for the particular in this sense. And I don't know, I'm not saying they don't exist, they do, but I don't personally know any artists who create out of an intentional, deep place of self-centeredness. But I do know many artists who don't know or haven't been provided with the opportunity to create any other way. So, for example, hypothetical writer Jane Doe has the next great American novel that she's writing. And it's this story that's just been kind of burning within her for ages. And she's writing it out of a sense of faithfulness to the art itself. It's not for her, but it's out of a sense of faithfulness to the art itself. It's the story that has got to get out of her. And as far as the impact that it might have on others, she does want it to have an impact on others. But whether it will and how, she does not know the answer to that question. It's vague. It's a hope. I hope if I create this out of a place of faithfulness to the art, that it will touch somebody else. But when someone gives you an opportunity to create, not out of that vague hope, but out of that sense of particularity, this art will touch this person or these people in this specific way. It seems like it's opening a door for that vague hope, that existential angst, to become a practical work that the artist can do. And I'd love to hear more from you about the role that you think the church can play in that.
I think, I agree with you. I don't like quick phrases, but the modernist paradigm imagines that if there is that particularity, in fact, I'll say the locating of something for a particular place and community, that sounds limiting and restricting to the artist, or it has. But I'm not sure that I'm finding very many artists that, in fact, believe that anymore, that there is something deeply encouraging about being asked by a community or belong to a community that says, we recognize one another's gifts and skills. That can be everywhere in the life of the church. But as we recognize that the artists can do something that is deeply valuable for the whole community, that's changing the game. Now, actually, to your question, I'll be honest, I don't reject at all the phrase doing something for the sake of the art. Certainly in ways, if we mean by that, just devotion to learning maximal skill in a procedure and in a medium and in design features, simply that is to be faithful to every demand of that oil painting, that size and the nature of the backing, where it's going to be, what it is about in some way, even if the aboutness, is abstractly defined, or that kind of devotion to that practice, devotion to art for itself. I buy it. I mean, I think, I can imagine the same thing for a great chef or a very skillful and gifted chef. I mean, it's everything about what is presented, from the recipe to the ingredients to the presentation and to the people who are going to enjoy it in a meal. All of that matters, so that, the serious chef will not want to downgrade or be satisfied with anything other than the highest degree that is demanded by that art. And I'm here, I say. But if the cultural conditions that we place artists in means that they have to have that devotion with no guarantee whatsoever that it will have any other impact or appreciation than maybe the artist herself, if no one publishes the novel or purchases the painting. And I just think for a lot of artists, maybe most, that's tough, Yeah, it's terrifying. It's the kind of thing that I know, many of them just live in fear of, that they devote themselves, they do something that is with their utmost, and nobody buys it. It just sits there in the closet, in the studio. So that's what I'm after, is are those necessary conditions? And I don't think I'm being long-winded here, but you've already named the other half of the equation, and that is the people who will be the stewards of that work and who realize that this is a work of art that, again, we may be commissioned, but it's a work of art that is going to enhance some feature of our community. If it's the church community, it might be their modes of worship, their liturgy. It might be those other kinds of liturgies, like the work of the people in service to those outside the church, or for the homeless and the hungry. And that reminds me, an example that I have seen before in years past, but I just had a very slow viewing with a lovely group of people just a couple of weeks ago. And that is in Siena. I mean, there are lots of towns that had what we call hospitals, ospedale. But in Siena, was typical then, it wasn't just dealing with sick people or people in need of the surgery at the time, although they did play that role. But they were often where the poor came for needs and supplies. They were also places where pilgrims might stop, for the night. But they also, as in Florence, were often, and these are funded by the confraternities, in the context of faith, but not even by the church itself, more of a civic operation. The hospitals were also places where orphans would be brought up, or even if a mother simply, could not imagine giving good care for a child, the mother could, maybe an illegitimate baby, all those circumstances that are sorrowful, could simply bring that baby in with anonymity to the hospital. This is the case in Siena, and know that the child would be taken in, would be brought up, would be educated, and in Siena even given a dowry, and work on arranging a good marriage for that young woman. So they were in for the long haul in that hospital, really dealing with all the 7 works of corporal mercy that Jesus mentions as that which separates the sheep from the goats. And what I'm saying is in the great entry hall, which would be where pilgrims would gather and others, there's an immense series of wall frescoes with each one of those activities featured. And so therefore, I'm coming back to us, it wouldn't be, in fact, it shouldn't be a matter of just copying those frescoes, but imagine if a church community or any community of people of faith were serious about their social care for those in need, taking care of the refugees, the homeless, the sojourners, all those in need of hospice care. And what if they were involved in that, but commissioned artists to do the best that they could do in painting and other media to depict and embody that work? And I know that in Siena, because of the captions and descriptions that were made even back then, it was a double-sided coin, these frescoes. They were, in fact, to say with some pride, this is what we do. This is our job, and we're committed to it. It's our work. We're happy. But it also, they were designed to keep, in a sense, keep the hospital administration, we'd say, straight with what they should be doing. What I'm saying is something simple. If you've got the painting there that tells you what you are doing and ought to be doing, then it's a continual goad of conscience in some way. How are we doing? You can imagine the person who comes in and is ill served. All they have to do is point up to the fresco and say, gee whiz, I was turned away, but I'm homeless. I'm a mother that can't take care of this baby, and you've rejected me. So they provide in that double role of both describing and prescribing what that community should be doing. Well, again, that was being long-winded with these examples, but it seems to me that back to the artists, to be able to be involved in making artworks like that, I think for more and more artists, that would be thrilling. Can I say, deeply moving to be asked to be part of, that work. And then I say, all this is to come full circle to say it isn't just the artists that have to change. It's the communities that need a lot of re-education and re-inspiration, and say to be able to make their own case for the importance of the visual arts as well as novels and poetry and musical compositions that, in fact, architecture itself and design of any building, any room, that all of those deserve tending to. And that means hiring artists, artisans, craftspeople who are able to do maximal justice to the theme. And I guess that's my phrase. It would be the parallel to your saying the artists care, the novelists care for just doing the best novel, that to be making it adequate to what art is. But what I would say is instead of a capital A art, to say maximally answerable to the job that is being housed in this particular place. And I think that artists, if they were being paid and honored and appreciated and given commissions as part of the community, I am optimistic that that would go well on all parties, on all sides.
I wish we could talk about this for 2 hours, but since we can't, I do want to get one other question. I'm actually beginning to think I should ask this question to everyone we have on the podcast, because it would be really interesting to see what kind of answers we get. But there is, in our correspondence prior to this conversation, we'd been talking about the phrase centric genius, and we'd mostly been taking issue the last few weeks with the phrase eccentric and saying, oh no, centric is better. But you took issue with the phrase genius. And it seems like, and I want to let you talk about that, but I want to tie it to a little bit of a larger conversation that we've been having really an ongoing basis. And that is the question of who gets to count as an artist. The assumption seems to be for most people that, well, the artist is someone who creates ex nihilo, for starters. Someone who is a musician or a dancer is not an artist in that respect. You have to create something that did not exist before, not merely translate something that someone else created. With that distinction, you just eliminated 3/4 of the arts. And then the second one is that within that category, you have a subcategory, which is what we really call artists. And those are the people who wake up in the morning with something to say. So if you create something ex nihilo that is a wood carving that has no purpose other than to tell a story or be beautiful, you're not trying to make some sort of social commentary with it, then you too do not get to count as an artist. So my question for you is, who gets to count as an artist?
I won't be giving the answer to that.
It must be definitive, and it must be 30 seconds or less.
Well, I can probably do neither, but it's a question that I just think about all the time. In fact, with bit by bit, I'm being willing to become more straight with an answer. So this is it. That phrase, which I saw in this new initiative of the Anselm Society, of the idea of the centric genius, I still want to say it sure sounds good to me because I understand the underlying intent, certainly a concern for reconnecting artists to a centered community. But yes, you're right. I balk a bit with the term genius, and I confess that, since this word, to some degree, keeps up what I might call the lionizing of the artist, capital A, that began mainly with 19th century Romanticism. Yeah, maybe earlier with someone like Giorgio Vasari, who in his Lives of the Painters, he underlined the stupendous genius of Michelangelo. So in some way, that was an important text that had influence. But I would like to rethink that term, and then to remind us that actually back in an age of Renaissance geniuses, to take that period in Italy, the word artist was not used as a categorical, concept for all people that made, for ex nihilo paintings and sculptors and things like that. So the term wasn't used. In fact, artist, the rhetorician, the good orator was an artist of rhetoric, indicated any masterful skill and breadth of application. So that's just a starter phrase that I'll say. But anyway, so that, again, I confess, I don't know if this will rub people the wrong way. I'm not sure anymore that artists used in that way are any more deserving of the title genius than someone who embodies, here's that phrase I just used, supreme skill in a craft that's coupled, yet not with imagining the completely unprecedented, but with the imaginative ability to know deeply the elements. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is I'm coupling skill with an answerability to whether it's the nature or the world or the person that are often obscured and forgotten through habituated conventions. That people that actually demonstrate that skill in other ways than, say, the visual artists, the great painters or something, that's exhibited in all kinds of vocations. Like cooking or designing gardens or in cabinetry or playing and even making musical instruments or, engaging in animal husbandry with both skill and care for the animal, that in teaching small children, I'm just rattling off a list, or in figuring out the most beautiful and functional way of installing the plumbing. So you see what I'm starting to add to is when someone writing icons, say, so that's, I could go on some long list, so that it seems to me that we could apply the word genius, though the word gets too spread out and thinned out, to more people than just what we call the artistic genius. Okay. And I actually find myself increasingly of the opinion, I'll put it that way, we need to associate artists, in fact, giving up using that word, with high craft in a particular physical medium. And referring to, in fact, that's what was the case, until the great capital A artists of the Romantic movement. I remind us that people, all those great artists that we can rattle off in the broad sweep of the Renaissance, they actually were referred to as goldsmiths or sculptors or architects or embroiderers or painters or guitar, lutanists. In other words, the word applied to the skill that they had mastered, not to, this vague internalized genius that erupts only when the spirit of the genius operates. It's much more concrete and down to earth than that, it seems to me. I know it was. That's how it was understood. And it strikes me that maybe even just as a counter for a while, we need to lift up in honoring fashion. And I'm thinking here just of church settings, the one who arranges the flowers in front of the altar that is just absolutely perfect for the holiday of the church year, the nature of the flowers available in the garden, with beautiful design, colors associated, all of that stuff. I mean, I'm saying when I go in and see some really just apt as well as gorgeous decoration of flowers, that comes with high skill, and it moves the congregation. It has a place in the liturgy in that way. Or the vestment designer, or the embroiderer, or the arranger of the gorgeous buffet table. And I'm thinking of people, these are roles that, of course, are at work in many, many church communities. The group that arranges the potluck and all of that stuff. In some way, it's not only demoting the artist. In fact, it's not that. It's saying those people who are gifted, and I say not only in the skill, this is where I have trouble describing it. I can use the word answerable to the occasion and answerable to the materials, who are in that way answerable to the earth and to the season. All of that is part, of what goes into that mixture of skill and deep sensitivity to the people involved in the occasion of the work. So anyway, I'm saying maybe we ought to get back to a robust use of the actual identifiers of those crafts and not just a generic artist. And I suppose, actually, we've had some good plumbing and some bad plumbing in our house. So I have a deep appreciation for the really skilled plumber. And in a certain way, I'm being brave here and saying, if we could put on the same, not lowered step, but the higher step of someone to whom we are indebted for living a rich and a beautiful and an answerable life to our duties. And anyone who helps with that, to me, I think we should be calling an artist. Maybe I've been giving a roundabout description of how, and it is a 19th century phenomenon, the separation of craft from art, or craftspeople from artists. And, I'll say it bluntly, I think that is pernicious. It divides people that ought not to work. It has no serious grounding to it. What it can happen in a negative way is that if we, give full autonomy to the artist, creating things ex nihilo, say, and if the product somehow does not meet those proper criteria of high command of the medium and, an answerability to the place and occasion that work of art is being made for, we both risk having a demeaned artwork, and we risk demeaning those people who do the great making in other areas. So I'm rambling, but that makes sense. I'm concerned about only applying genius to visual artists or composers, say, and not to other people who in their own terrain are exhibiting equal genius. But then I'm not really comfortable with the word genius in the sense that it sets apart and it subtly dissociates these people, these skilled craft people, from the community itself. And I think that's what we have to overcome. Okay, there was a ramble.
It seems like what you've just articulated, I'll have to think about it longer, but it seems like it could even be a key to a lot of other ideas that we've talked about today. Because if you start to make this move and you stop thinking about it in terms of genius, stop thinking about artist, capital A in quite that sense, and start thinking of it more in that context that you've articulated, mastering a skill in a particular context, particular reason, with a sense of responsibility to something. That does a lot of interesting things potentially, because it brings artists, the ones that we call artists now, closer to everyone else. It elevates everyone else in the sense that you can look that plumber in the eye and say, hey, are you committed to being a master of your craft? Are you committed to doing what you do beautifully for the good of your community and the glory of God? And it also, I think, begins to demystify art just a little bit so that the person who is on the receiving end of what is created can maybe be a little less fearful in putting a toe forward in trying to experience it, enter into it, and even building a community life around it in some cases. Well, thank you for the time that we spent together, John.
Yeah, I see. Well, you're welcome. Our hour is up. So I hope you can glean something good from this, Brian. It's I love talking
Likewise, I
with
wish
you.
we could do it a lot more often. The centric artist conversation continues. If you want to hear more podcasts on the subject, just listen to what came before or after on this podcast, or head over to the Believe to See podcast, or simply go to anselmsociety.org/centric-genius to see all the podcasts that we're recording, all of the articles that we're publishing. We've got profiles of people we consider to be centric geniuses that we're releasing over the course of the next few months. You should be able to look back by the end of April and see dozens and dozens of different stories and examples and narratives to start to paint a different picture of an artist who, instead of being at the fringes and misunderstood and fearful, can be strong and supported and a deeply valuable and valued member of the church and member of the community. Until next time, I'm Brian Brown with John Skillen today, and we'll talk to you next time.